Did you know there was a French queen who bathed in donkey milk? Well, that's not actually true. There was a queen who bathed in ass milk. Yeah, that definitely sounds more scandalous, but it's still not quite right. The queen bathed in the milk of female donkeys. And while that does sound a lot better, it still doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But if you think about it for just a moment longer, it starts to make perfect sense. This was Isabella of the House of Bourbon, Queen of France from 1364 to 1376 and a major player in the 100 Years' War between England and France. She was also a very vain woman, so vain that she would do pretty much anything to preserve her beauty. I'm your host, and you're watching this channel. Join me today as we look back at the life of one of history's most vain women and find out why she bathed in donkey milk. But first, before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Also, be sure to leave us a comment. We love reading them and sometimes even respond to them. So what should we talk about next? Leave your ideas down below. Isabella of Bourbon was born in 1334, just 3 years before the start of the 100 Years' War. Her father was Peter, Duke of Bourbon, and her mother was Joanna, Countess of Kent. Her parents arranged for her to marry Charles V, Dauphin of France, basically making her a Princess of France, which is how she became known as the Princess of Blood. In other words, she was destined to become queen. Now let's fast forward a bit. Charles V had come into his own by now. He descended to the throne in 1364, having inherited it from his grandfather, Charles IV. It seems Charles V really enjoyed the finer things in life because he married two women within the space of 4 years. He married Blanche of Bourbon in 1365, and then Isabella of Bourbon in 1368. Not only was Isabella his cousin, but she was also his former wet nurse. She gave birth to their first child, a girl they named Isabella, in 1370. Then came Jean in 1371, another girl. And in 1372 Charles and Isabella welcomed a son who they named Louis. They weren't done either. After giving birth to a stillborn son in 1374, Isabella conceived again and gave birth to another son in 1376. While all this was happening, Europe was changing. While Isabella was born into the royal family, she wasn't the only person vying for the throne. England's King Edward III had been fighting to claim the French throne since 1337. Up until 1360, Charles had been able to fend off the English, but after losing the Battle of Poitiers, he was captured and imprisoned for the next 6 years. Isabella's husband ruled France from his prison cell. Then in 1364, he finally returned to Paris after paying a hefty ransom for his freedom. In 1369, Charles and Edward agreed to a truce, and Edward went back on his word and broke it immediately. The following year, Charles was forced to flee to Normandy, leaving Isabella and the children behind in Paris. When he left, he entrusted Isabella with the defense of the kingdom. Unfortunately, Edward took advantage of Charles's absence and laid siege to the city. Isabella bravely held off the English for 7 months. Eventually, Edward lifted the siege and withdrew his troops, but not before burning much of the countryside. Basically, Isabella was a badass queen who showed her subjects that she didn't need a king to protect them. Now let's jump back to 1365. 2 years before the siege, Charles had given his wife Blanche the title regent of France. Now, to be fair, this was a largely ceremonial position, but technically it made Blanche a queen. Unfortunately for Blanche, she developed schizophrenia and was declared unfit to rule. That same year, Charles had her committed to a mental institution, where she would spend the rest of her life. Obviously, he needed someone else to fill the role of queen, and he chose Isabella. By 1376, Isabella had proved herself to be a capable regent, which likely led her husband to name her his heir. But Edward III refused to accept her as queen, and so war continued. Then in 1380, Charles V died. As I mentioned earlier, he'd been suffering from a detached retina, which caused him to go blind. Supposedly, he mistook Isabella for Blanche, his former queen, and attempted to grope her. When she resisted, he slapped her. She got fed up with his behavior and threw him out of bed. The old king fell and hit his head, which caused the retinal detachment to worsen and ultimately led to his death. Now, according to some sources, when Charles died, Isabella had his eyes gouged out and placed in a jar. Then she put the jar under the bed of Edward III's daughter, who was engaged to be married to Isabella's son, Jean. You have to wonder if Isabella did this to ensure her son's future claim to the throne or if she just wanted to scare the hell out of her son's fiancé. Maybe it was both. With Charles V dead, Isabella stepped aside and allowed her son John to take over as regent. Then she retired to the Château de Bercy and waited for her son to grow up and take his rightful place on the throne. But here's where things get weird. In the early 14th century, bathing was a common practice among the French elite. It was seen as a symbol of wealth and power. Most people couldn't afford a bathtub, much less someone to fill it with warm water, so they didn't bathe. Queen Isabella, however, could afford it. In fact, she could afford an entire bathroom suite, including a bathtub filled with donkey milk. But why donkey milk? Well, it turns out donkey milk was considered a secret weapon against aging. It was believed that donkey milk could restore a person's youth by removing blemishes, smoothing wrinkles, and restoring elasticity to the skin. This may seem strange to us today, but remember, this was a time before modern science. People didn't understand the cause of aging, and so they tried all sorts of wacky things to stay young. It seems Queen Isabella was well aware of this trend and jumped on it. While historians don't know exactly what kind of bath she took, they do know she ordered large quantities of donkey milk delivered to her home on a regular basis. It's believed she soaked in milk baths several times a week, perhaps every day, during her retirement. Of course, there are no surviving records of what the Queen thought of the milk baths. But considering she continued to have them delivered throughout her retirement, it's safe to say she liked them. Unfortunately, Isabella's bathing habits didn't do much for her longevity. She died in 1383 at the age of 49. Her son Jean succeeded her as the Duke of Berry and the Count of Poitiers, but he too died young in 1416 at the age of 43. The throne then passed to Charles's brother, who became Charles VI. Isabella's obsession with her looks wasn't the only thing that made her stand out. She was also a patron of the arts and sciences and helped to promote the careers of many famous writers and artists, including Christine de Pizan, one of the first feminist writers in history. But despite her intelligence and charm, Isabella is best remembered for her bizarre bathing habits. The story goes that one day Isabella was relaxing in her donkey milk bath when a group of peasant women entered her bathroom without knocking. They were shocked to see the Queen bathing in milk, and they couldn't help but laugh. Isabella was furious and ordered them to be thrown into prison. The peasant women were charged with trespassing and disrespecting the Queen. They were sentenced to spend 1 month in jail and were only released after they'd each given birth to a baby boy. Once they were free, Isabella ordered that their babies be placed in the same bathtub she used. Then she allegedly laughed hysterically and called herself the lactating queen. Historians aren't sure how much of this story is true, but it makes for a great anecdote nonetheless. And while the story about the peasant women is probably just a rumor, there's no doubt that Isabella bathed in donkey milk. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it. Why would a vain queen not want to take a bath made of milk that was supposed to keep her young? So what do you think? Did bathing in donkey milk help Isabella stay young? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.